Hello, welcome back for part 3, the final part on John Singleton Copley that we will be looking at for this class. And you might notice something a little different. We're going to be looking at a pretty famous work that features a shark. So right away that puts us on a completely different track than what we've been looking at so far with this class, which has primarily been portraits. We looked at a series of portraits by Copley from both his colonial and English period and looked at how he tells a story about who these people are during these different times. But now, cue the music. Let's go for something completely different, and we're going to look at the precedent, perhaps, of this famous 1975 movie about 200 years earlier with Copley's own Watson and the Shark. So I have to say that I think this painting is just as unsettling as that famous poster of Jaws and many of the movie's iconic scenes, and I think this group of children probably agrees with me. It's pretty terrifying, and it really seems more like it should be titled Watson Eaten by the Shark than Watson and the Shark. But as we'll see, that's not what happened. So this was actually based on a real event, a recent event and a personal event, which sets it a little bit apart from what a history painting typically portrayed. What we usually see in history painting are history stories, right? Biblical stories, Greek myth, Roman history, legendary Roman history, sort of embellished tales of the founding of Rome, things like that, not contemporary stories. We saw that Benjamin West broke this tradition by portraying the death of General Wolfe, a great commander of a pretty recent battle, and now we're going to see what Copley does with the tradition of history painting. I was fortunate myself to recently see this painting at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's a little distorted here, as you can see by the side of the frame, to get a real sense of the scale, but his technique is immaculate. Copley is a true genius at putting pigment on canvas, but let's see how he works those details together. So let's get in just a little bit closer and I'll tell you the story of what actually happened that day. Young Brooke Watson was originally from England, but his parents had died, so he had been sent as an orphan to live with his aunt and uncle in the United States. And his uncle was a merchant who often worked in the West Indies. And so at the age of 14, Brooke Watson begins to work for his uncle, and what we see here is an event that happened not too much later. They're in the Havana harbor, and he decides to go swimming, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was attacked by a shark twice. What we see is this final moment of will he be rescued or not? And that's pretty typical of history painting. The artist would pick a dramatic moment of the story or a turning point in the story because the artist knows that's what the audience really wants to see, something that they can really dig their teeth into. That's a very bad pun. Because what we don't see is what just had its teeth dug into, which is Brooke Watson's leg. And what we are left to decide is, will he lose his life as well? I'm not really so sure this painting looks like he's about to be rescued. Again, it almost looks like Brooke Watson is the lunch. That rope seems a little too slack, the hands are just a little too far away, and that shark, he's just a little bit too close for things to come together in Brooke Watson's favor in this painting. However, we know that he is saved because he's the one who commissioned the painting from Copley in the first place. You might remember from part 2, or you might want to remember from part 2, hint hint, that the posture of Hugh Montgomery was based on a pretty famous precedent. This figure of young Watson struggling in the water is also thought to have been modeled after another famous precedent. This was an example that was in the Louvre Museum at the time, and it was known then as the Borghese Gladiator. And so if we think of the heroic qualities of the gladiator rising above the odds, that same thing might be said of Watson here. I mean, he's really facing the odds here, but yet he's able to be saved and ostensibly defeat the shark. We can see that somebody on the boat is about to impale the shark, and the shark will no longer be threatening young Watson. Turning our attention to the figure of the young man who is about to impale the shark in this painting, we find precedent with that figure in that of St. George and the Dragon. And while Copley probably didn't see this particular statue of St. George, there are many examples in statues, in illuminated manuscripts, and in paintings which depict a very similar staging with St. George, his arm raised over his head, plunging the spear down to smite the dragon, Anyways, as a quick aside, the legend of St. George actually grew from a historical figure. He was a member of the Imperial Guard, Praetorian Guard, for the Roman Emperor Diocletian. He was ultimately persecuted and beheaded for those beliefs. And centuries later, the legend of this soldier grew into the legend of St. George and the Dragon. And so we often see St. George depicted as a medieval knight, especially during the medieval period, but even later in the Baroque. The legend is reborn again, in a way, in this painting by Copley, only now he's a young sailor who smites not a dragon, but a shark. And turning now to the shark, let's take a closer look. And I apologize because he is a little bit creepy. And there's definitely a few weird things going on with this shark, things we don't typically find on a shark. But it's not quite as off as you might think, and the things that aren't quite right, well, I think maybe there was a reason for Copley doing that. The type of shark that attacked Watson was probably a bull shark. They're very common in that area, and they look a little different than the great white shark that perhaps immediately comes to our imagination. But when we see a photo of the bull shark with its mouth open a little bit and you see that weird kind of jawline pushing away from the rest of its head, I mean, yeah, this guy's a little bit creepy, kind of threatening. We can see then that Copley hasn't totally altered the shape of the shark, but he certainly has exaggerated a few things, especially that ear. And in a way, he's kind of turning the shark into a monster/shark, not simply a shark. And this idea of turning a sea creature into a sea monster actually has precedent in many different depictions of the story of Jonah and the whale. In this example, we kind of see that. We see the figures of the men in the boat look pretty realistic still. But in this engraving after a painting by Peter Paul Rubens, the whale really doesn't look much like a whale. It really looks like a giant fish or some kind of composite creature. And a second example, we see it even more so. This really looks much more like some kind of sea dragon than a whale or even any kind of fish that we know of. So why are they doing this? Do they have no idea what a whale looks like? Or is this a choice that they're making on purpose, to make a kind of archetype of a monster, the monster that consumes Jonah, from which he is reborn? And it's important to note that in the two earlier examples, we are seeing Jonah being flung into the sea, and in Copley's painting, we're seeing the moment of salvation when Watson is pulled out of the sea. We might also notice that the figure of Jonah in the engraving by Johannes Sadler looks startlingly like the image of Watson in Copley's painting. And before you think I'm getting too carried away with all of this, it's good to remember that all of this borrowing of motifs and iconography was very much done on purpose. As we saw with Benjamin West's painting of the death of General Wolfe, the iconography of religious paintings very much influenced art, whether it was additional religious paintings or secular paintings. The way the bodies were positioned had certain meanings that people understood when they looked at it. But we also have to be careful in overreading the paintings. For example, when we look at the assortment of crew members on that lifeboat for Watson, we notice that the African crew member has pride of place, almost the apex of the triangular formation, which was typically reserved for the most exalted character of the composition. This might lead one to believe that perhaps Brooke Watson was an abolitionist, subtly making his views known in this painting by Copley. However, we have to look at Brooke Watson and see what he did for a living, which was very much profit in industries very much related to and dependent upon slave trade, to know that this was not the case. Many scholars believe that this is simply how he remembered the event happening. So as we conclude this talk on Copley, I'm going to show you two more versions of this painting. The first one we see now. And this is a version of the painting he did for himself. So after he finishes the first version, the one we've been looking at, and Brooke Watson takes it with him, it was also a painting that brought a lot of critical fame for Copley, and so he paints it again. And when we look at them side by side, and also see that the dimensions are exactly the same, we can see he based the second version very much on the same underdrawings. And this version he kept in his studio to remind people who came to visit him of what a great artist he was, and this really was his claim to fame. It really put him on the map. 1778, he hadn't been in England all that long, and this really helped jettison his career while he was there. Interestingly, A few years later, he does it again. And look at this version. It's about half the size. It's vertical instead of horizontal. It's very moody. Look at how dark the sky is and how murky the water is. And then you look at the finer details and you notice that the brushwork is a little bit looser. And all of this creates even an increased sense of anxiety when you look at this painting. It really almost seems romantic. And we'll get to the romantic period, but first we need to spend a little time in the neoclassic. And we'll be doing that next week.